what are we?
We
How long
can,
are we going to wait,
with
Lawrence?
10:03, I reckon we can
There we go,
make a
Janie's. There we
start.
go, Janie's coming. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I guess shall I take over, Lawrence, and start hosting, or
Yeah, look, I
we
think
can
you know, the
we can
obvious
bounce off each other?
intention of the practice groups is always to just have a bit of fun and everything. Um, since you came up with this fantastic topic, um, I'm more than happy for you to lead the way today. Absolutely.
Sure, sure. Well, how about we find out first of all why people have selected this particular aspect of the offerings, because there was self-care and then there was obviously process instructions. I'm keen to understand what people have identified as being their outcomes and why this might have been an interesting topic, because it got a bit of a run, didn't it? It was pretty much a
By far, it was a landslide. Yeah.
yeah. So that's great, and so I'm keen to hear from everyone so that we can start to find out what people are trying to bridge in regards to some gaps, or whether it's just curiosity or whatever. So let's get a sense of what's happening on the group, as we obviously have more people joining us. G'day, Uli.
Yeah, I can
So
give
who?
it a start if you
Yeah.
want on that. So when you first mentioned the topic to me, I think for a while there, my brain was just trying to figure out what structuring process instructions actually even meant.
Mm,
So it was I guess a curiosity around it initially, but I know that you've been craftily asking questions in the Hypnotherapist networking group around this, and I began to recognise a little bit more about what is it you meant by that and how it could be useful in working with clients, particularly in a more content-free sort of way. So for me, understanding that aspect of it got me actually really quite excited.
mm.
So that's why, absolutely after you recommended, I thought, yeah, this is such a great topic and one that I think I could really personally benefit from.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lawrence. So we're getting a few more people joining. So yes, I have
I'll
been
keep an eye on
putting
the waiting room while
questions into the group, but I don't know whether they've been crafty or craftly, but they're definitely be questions. But yeah, so you and I have plenty of conversations, Lawrence. So one of the things that I keep highlighting is that the ability to be able to work content free is a really important skill, especially if you don't know what's going on with the client, and also how to craft hypnotic language on the fly. So that's important as well, and especially if you've come out of the background where you've been given scripts and things like that, and you can be scripted but not necessarily read a script. And that was a useful distinction that Bob Burns made in his recent training. Um, the perspective is that most people have their patter, and when you look at an induction or when you look at a script that you've been reading through, then you might not notice the process suggestions in there, and that can make it a little bit challenging if you're trying to be content free. So it's my hope that by covering this today, everyone gets a sense of, when you look at this stuff, you can actually see the process inside of all of the content suggestions, and how you run the content through a process at all times. So that's part of the reason why I think it sparked Lawrence's attention as well, because I started running a whole bunch of language, and it was like all process suggestions, and it's something that we should all be able to do. This way, you don't have to have a knowledge of what it is that they're working through, especially if they want to work very privately.
That ended last night.
Oh, hello. So who'd like to also put their suggestions into the group as to what they'd like to get out of today? And I noticed that we got from Deborah, it's always good to practice NLP process and integrate this with hypnotic practice. Yes, absolutely. Dare I say that it's not NLP process, it's just process. There's NLP patterns, which have been modeled from people generally, and it's their process for how they do what they do in the world, how they do amazing things. But dare I say that the process instructions have always been inside of hypnosis. NLP is pretty much just a modeling methodology. That's it. Didn't create the process, just mapped out the process of how people were structuring their subjective reality so that they could rally their resources to go out into the world and do amazing things. So, and as modelers, that's what we're interested in mapping, is what's their process, not necessarily their content. We're not necessarily interested in their content. In actual fact, we're not very much interested in the content at all. So from an NLP standpoint, it was impressed upon me very early that if you were to provide, I guess, access to NLP or the field of NLP to a psychologist or an engineer is more likely to pick it up much faster than a psychologist, because perhaps the psychologist is interested in the content, but the engineer is interested in the process. So we're interested in the process. Who else would like to put out their outcomes for being here today?
Maybe I will take a word. Hello, everyone. I'm new
Gotcha.
here. My name is Katya. Yeah, probably just Paul knows me. We're neighbors. I voted for this topic. There was a few different things that were interesting to me. The first one was about, I just want to understand when it is more beneficial to work content free. So, because probably I haven't faced so far cases when people didn't know what they want or they didn't know what to talk about. So they always were coming to me with a certain reason. They had certain pain, they had certain problem that they wanted to solve. And not always they knew how to do it, but they always knew what to do. So that's why I was interested in which cases it will be more beneficial. Of course, I think for practitioners it's easier to work content free, not just to go inside and all these things. So this is the thing that I was interested in. And secondly, because English is my second language, for me, this document that Paul sent before, it was so good. I really love to see all the words that I can use. So that's perfect. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think those are two main reasons why I voted for this.
Yeah, great. And Katja's my next door neighbour as well. So Katja just moved in. Hey, have you joined the network?
Almost can see you.
So Katja's literally right next door in the next townhouse. So it's like far away and yet socially distanced. Great. Yes, lovely. And who else would like to care? Who else would care to share their outcomes being here?
I'll share.
Craig. Yeah.
I'm familiar with it, but it's always better to like review and you get some fresh ideas and get better at it. And it's also a wonderful process of exploration, because quite often people have got an enormous shopping list of, I don't want this. What do you want? Crickets. Yeah. So there's that kind of process of like extracting something out of them of like, well, if we design the outcome, what the hell would it be?
And also, how do they know that they've got a problem? That's one of the things that that I always ask them is, how's it a problem for you? But how do you know that it's a problem? Because it's a problem if you have a desired outcome. Sometimes the desired outcome isn't specified enough for them. They don't know what they want. They know what they don't want, and it's generally framed or lensed through, language with negation. And the absence of something doesn't necessarily mean the presence of something else. So also keep in mind that that if we continue to ask their conscious mind about what they want, it may be an ill-formed outcome as well, and it may not necessarily be what we would reference in NLP as being ecological. And perhaps what's happened is the reason why they're coming to therapy is because they've been trying to patch their life up with unecological fixes. They've just been trying to patch it as best as they can, try and manage it as best as they can, but it's resulting in more things occurring. There's more consequences. There's maybe a downstream consequence to something that they did over here, and so it's you can ask their conscious mind all you want, but if they could consciously solve it, they would have done that already.
And quite often they're also chasing the things they ought to have. I'll be happy when I get, because society says if you've got this, you'll be happy. If you've got the Ferrari, and the conscious mind has kind of bought into all that, but it's not congruent.
Yeah, and the ought is a pointer to a particular type of language that implies that it's rule based, that they ought to. It's almost like I should have this. So it's what we would reference as a modal operator of necessity. So in the material that was sent through to you, it's you've got with the hypnotic language in the columns, you've got a lack of referential index. You've got a modal operator of possibility, unspecified verbs, and then you've got nominalizations. And these are the jargonistic things that came out of general semantics and linguistics. It's not necessarily the way that we talk in normal English. And so what you referenced there before, Craig, ought to, is a bit like I should, or I must, or I have to, and they're known as modal operators of necessity, and often that can create a bit of a challenge for them, because it's usually somebody else's rules or values that they're pointing to that's happening outside of their conscious awareness. And so as one of my clients said, one of their friends had told them that they were shooting all over themselves.
Yes.
And I really like that. So so you hear
That's
clients
Tony
coming in and
Robbins.
they're shooting all over themselves. So so we want to move it from the should, the must, the have to into the realm of possibility and even the realm of desire, right? You know, an outcome usually should be, if we're looking at through the lens of a SMART goal, of you know, it should be specific, measurable, achievable, or attainable, or the A could also be attractive, realistic, and time bound. But goals should be often geared towards an outcome that they find attractive and appealing, and that there's a desire there. So the modal operators of desire, that they hunger for it, that they lust after it, that they're, you know, thirsty for it, that any of those sorts of things, you know, and some of these have gustatory elements to it as well. But the modal operator of desire, you know, what do you want is a question that's linked with desire, not what do you need to have or must have or should have or have to have. So usually our first question as therapists will usually have modal operators of desire in it. What would you like to have happen that isn't happening currently, is another way of framing it up. So and what would that do for you? Now that's a shift into the intent. What's the intent that sits behind the desired outcome? But yes, usually what will happen is you'll have people come in and they've tried to patch their life up with a whole series of potential unecological strategies. And so when you're asking their conscious mind for it, they're going to give you more of the same. So, you know, it's nice for them to feel heard, but if that was the level of awareness or the level of consciousness you wanted to work with, well, then you'd probably be doing CBT and stuff like that instead of hypnosis work. So, you know, as I think Einstein put it, you can't solve the problem at the same level of thinking that created the problem. So to me, hypnosis is about shifting them out of that level and getting them to think about things in new and different ways. And if they don't consciously know what the answer is to the questions that you pose, even better. It's not about them understanding why. It's about how they move from here to there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the process that matters, in my opinion. They've made up a whole bunch of cause-effect statements in their head and what we would call complex equivalents or beliefs about how the world works, and that doesn't matter. Personally, I'm interested in using my language to help them to contact that innate intelligence that resides inside them, to facilitate that, and their conscious mind doesn't necessarily need to understand or know. So that's the nature of the content-free work that I do. I don't know what the solution is. They don't know what the solution is. They don't know what resources they're rallying. They just notice things changing. And the good thing about them not consciously knowing, so I'll come back to Katja's question, the good thing about them not consciously knowing what the solution is and not knowing what has been decided at the unconscious or subconscious level is that they can't pick the therapy apart later on. They can't unpack all the suggestions that you've given because you haven't given them any directive to do something specific, and then they go, all right, well, you know, from now on when you pick up a cigarette and you smoke it, it'll taste like crap, for instance, you know, like an aversion therapy suggestion. And they go, well, I'm going to go and test that out. You know, they go and try and unpick the therapy. I had one client try and do that, and the suggestion still held up, but that was a very direct suggestion, and I'd done a whole bunch of other things prior to that. But yeah, you'll find that content free is really useful if you've got someone who really likes to be analytical and perhaps stays out of going into a deeper rapport with their unconscious mind. So hopefully that answers Katja's question. And Craig, it's good to see that you've got some of that knowledge coming into this as well. So it's good to draw on the brain's trust in this group to make sure that we're all using process-orientated suggestion. We're all using process suggestions. This isn't something new for you. It's just what we're doing is, in the jumble of stuff that you're getting, we're just going, all right, let's take this little bit out and let's explore that. Then when you actually start to see it for what it is, then your reticular activating systems are going to be able to notice it more often. And I wouldn't necessarily suggest that directly to your conscious or unconscious minds about what you might notice after this, or perhaps the little words and things like that, or phrases that indicate that perhaps someone's using any one of their 5 senses, or perhaps changing their orientation in time as you look back on what I've just said now and replay it inside your mind. I wouldn't suggest that you do that in a very direct manner, because it's rather direct, isn't it? I mean, you'd see that suggestion coming a million miles away, wouldn't you?
Yeah, along with any other embedded commands.
Yeah, yeah. So, like whatever you do, just put yourself as a bit of a fly on the wall and imagine that being suggested to somebody else. And perhaps there'll be a part of you that takes away some things consciously. Perhaps there'll be some things that unconsciously you just do and you don't notice until much later. And then you catch yourself doing it, perhaps on the third or the fourth time. And then you realize just how much you learned from today. So what did you notice about what I just gave you as a whole bunch of language? A whole bunch of stuff.
Well, an exceedingly well-crafted embedded command to slide past the conscious, but give detailed instructions to the non-conscious as to what to do and how to use it.
Yeah, but what have I told you to do?
Sit back, relax.
Sit back and relax, if that's what you took away from it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, imagine sitting back and relaxing in the back corner there, Kate, observing that body in the chair, just taking it all in, just letting it all go through to the wicket keeper, right? Could you imagine doing that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just giving you a whole bunch of process instructions, just giving you a whole bunch of things that are in the material there. But as you can see, I'm not using a script. I'm not prepared. I'm just simply working through lots of different aspects of what you've got in that sheet. So those sheets are really useful as guides for how you structure your language. It's not a script though. Imagine you've got a whole bunch of ingredients and you can put all those ingredients together in lots of different ways. And then when you work out the permutations of how many different instructions you could provide, it's just infinite. And that provides you a greater degree of flexibility, behavioral flexibility, mental agility when you're actually working with your clients. But there are some things that I'm playing around with. So, and it's using all of those elements there and a whole bunch more. So, so far I've given you a bit of a demonstration, and we haven't done any hypnotic work. And for those of you who know me well, you know that I don't necessarily buy into the idea of a trance state per se, which means that the normal waking state is more than enough to facilitate wonderful experiences. So therefore, the use of your language and the precision within which you use your language is really important, because be as if they're in hypnosis all the time and your language is exceptionally hypnotic for them and for you. And what I'm doing inside my mind is I'm moving through the different processes and then just literally describing it to other people. So I'm running a little mental simulation inside my head when I'm doing it. So for instance, if I'm inviting Kate, for instance, to imagine that as her eyes rest on the screen, that she can float up and out of her body and into the back left-hand corner of the room and observe the body sitting in the chair as it just gazes with that sense of stillness at that screen. Perhaps there'll be a moment in which her unconscious mind closes the eyes and her conscious mind can just sit in the back corner and observe that all happening. So I'm having a bit of fun with Kate right now in that sense. But there you go. Like, is that an induction? Is it an evocation? Is it an invocation? It's definitely using process instructions. And so when you look at NLP patterns, if they've been modeled, so if they have been modeled, so there are some process or some things that are taught that is the content of NLP that is not process orientated. For instance, for any of you who are familiar with Robert Dilts's work and Dilts's neurological levels of vision, mission, purpose, then identity, then values and belief, then capabilities and resources, then behaviors, then context. That is a content model. That is not a process model. It's a very useful content model, and it gives you some categories to then start to structure some process suggestions in there, but it's not a content model, and it's not even logically set. It's not a logical level. It's not a logical inclusion set. So if we take, for instance, the rewind technique, as a lot of people have learnt it, or what used to be, what's known in NLP as the fast, the trauma reduction pattern, which was originally called the phobia cure. And because nobody can say that they cure anything, it became the trauma reduction pattern, and then it became the rewind technique. And I think the rewind technique was popularized by the Human Givens guys. So you know, if we take a look at the first stages of it, for instance, does anyone know what the first stages of the rewind technique, the fast phobia cure, the trauma reduction pattern is?
Did it dissociate them from the
Yes.
fearing, their phobia? The first
So dissociation is definitely part of it, and that's part of the process, right? The first thing you ask them to do is generally imagine themselves being in a movie or watching a television. So that is, in a sense, setting the scene, but the act of imagining is a process. So you already start off with a process, and the content is the cinema or it's the television screen. So it really doesn't matter what they imagine, that's the content. What you're doing is inviting them to engage in a process of imagining. And so the next part of the process is to have them remember a time in which they had a significant traumatic event, and to remember a time just before it and a time just after it. So a time when they're safe on either side. So what we're doing is we're setting a safety sandwich, so to speak, a time before and a time after. And to see themselves at that time just before the event. So already see is a process, and to put that image up on the screen and to make it black and white. So once you put the image up on the screen, the image up on the screen is part of the process. The content is whatever was in the scene, but the process is put it up on the screen, make it black and white. The moment you change the qualities of the picture, you're affecting the process. Once that's set up on the screen, they generally are encouraged to float up and out of their body. And that's the dissociation, Kate, that you're talking about. But there's the next process to dissociate. So there's a single dissociation there. And what it's meant to do is create a visual kinesthetic dissociation. In other words, I'm separating what I see from what I feel. So that's part of the process. So dissociation is an essential part of the process there, because we want to dissociate them from bad stuff and associate them into good stuff. That's the general principle that we should be engaging in across our therapeutic approach. It's part of the reason why regression therapy and regression back to cause is generally something that has a tendency to re-traumatize people, because they go back and they re-experience through an associated perspective all of the trauma that they've experienced, which isn't the real trauma because the map is not the territory. It's whatever their brain decides to create, and it changes the trauma anyway. But why traumatize them any more than they need to? So regression back to cause is generally not seen as being as useful as other processes. So the first association is they see the body sitting in the chair. The second association is they float up to the projector room, and so that's a double visual kinesthetic dissociation now. So we're doing the dissociation twice. So now they see the body, or they see the person who's watching the person who's sitting in the chair, watching the person who's up on the screen. So technically there's 3 VKs in there. There's 3 visual kinesthetic dissociations inside of that. Now these are all processes. So what we're doing is we're just simply moving them away from the content that they have a negative association with multiple times to reduce the sensations, the somatic experience that they're having, and to distance themselves emotionally from the event as well. That's the process inside the pattern. Then when they run the projector, right, it runs from that triple VK dissociation, from that meta position, and it runs in black and white from beginning to end, and that's a test inside of that pattern to see whether they have a phobic response. No phobic response, sufficiently dissociated. Phobic response, got to dissociate them all. So there's a little test inside of that. Once it runs, gets to the end of that movie, it then stops at the safety point where they're safe. And then what we do is we float them back down into their body. They then get up. They then associate even more into the actual picture of themselves when they were safe after the event, after the traumatized event. There's another process, right? So all of this is process orientated. Then what happens is once they step in, it literally rewinds or runs backwards, and we change all of the process again. It becomes life size, color. They're seeing through their eyes, hearing through their ears, feeling through their skin. There's the process instructions. They're using their senses, and they're coming straight back, almost like on a slingshot, back in reverse through the actual experience and we're scrambling what's known as the submodalities or the qualities of the experience. So it's scrambled because it's all backwards. We're also moving them through time, because there's after. Now we're scrambling it and also moving them back through time to the point where they were safe before the event. And what we're doing is we're just scrambling all the coding. The other thing as well is that that they are also often separate and distinct from the context. So it's a separation of self and context. They're in the context, but they're not associated into the context. So when they run right back to the very beginning of that pattern, we're just messing with the process by which they remember the event. And when you do that enough times and blank it out and then have them, run the movie once again from the projector room to the beginning and then rewind it again, the more times you do it, the harder it is for them to have the same sensations, to run the same process that they once did. And so that rewind technique is very much a good example of lots and lots and lots of process-orientated suggestions. But the content can change depending on the nature of the traumatic experience. So if any of you have been exposed to that, that's what you've been doing. It's process that changes it. It's not about reframing the meaning and reframing the content and turning the, if it was a dog into a little dog and all that sort of stuff. Though you could do all that stuff. There's definitely some things around compulsion blowouts where you make something so big, so massive, so huge that it just is ridiculous and people end up going beyond their phobic response and they just go, you know what, I can't laugh at a dog that's 30 stories high. It's beyond ridiculous. I just can't do it. So they lose their phobic response to little dogs or mid-sized dogs or large dogs because this dog that's 30 stories high just doesn't seem real. And so now their associations change. But what we're doing is we're playing with the process. So are there any questions about this at all? Because I think that I'm just going to pause here because I've been talking a lot and this is supposed to be a networking event, not a training. So I just want to make sure that people understand what I'm talking about when we're looking at these.
I completely get it. I think my mind's blown a little bit at the moment because I've always looked at it more as being about the content, and you're absolutely right about focusing as much on the process. And for me, it's beginning to perhaps get a few clogs going about, maybe sometimes there should be more focus on how the person perhaps is internalizing or how their process is working and understanding their internalized processes. Before jumping into the content thinking this magic process content works. So it's that's been really useful just in itself.
Yeah, we get sucked into the content and the goal is to actually pay attention to how they're running their internal processes, how they're thinking, what's the structure of their thinking. So if we think of our thoughts as being picture, sound, sensation, smells and tastes, that's the constituent parts. What people call their thoughts is actually it's the process of thinking, or what's the parts of the process that they're running, and inside of the content you'll start to pick up, are they actually seeing through their own eyes, for instance, or are they seeing themselves in the picture? Are they associated or are they dissociated? If they're associated, I guarantee you that they're going to have really strong somatic experiences associated with the actual experience. If they're dissociated, probably less so. If anybody's ever worked with people who experience depersonalization, and they there we go. So Kylie, do you want to share anything about what you've noticed about working with people like that?
I was trying to find my mute button. No, I haven't worked with anyone yet, but I had it myself. I had dyspersonation disorder. I don't have it anymore. I worked out what it was. I found out through a kinesiologist I just wasn't in my body. Yeah, no,
there's a good one, right? Wasn't in your body. There's a reference to being dissociated, right? But when you actually start to ask someone, how they do the process of dissociation, it's almost like they're floating up and they're observing themselves from a different perspective, and they're there, but there's this. It's almost like things are out of phase, and you're hearing all of the wonderful qualities. It's actually a really useful skill. It's just not a skill that's used in an appropriate way for people who are experiencing depersonalization. And sometimes they can also experience it when they're in social situations. They're feeling anxiety and they almost feel like they're. But listening to the way, like they're there, but they're not there.
I'm here, but I'm not here.
Yeah, and they use really wonderful language that you could use with people who are very associated to things and probably don't know how to dissociate. And the challenge for people who experience depersonalization is how do we teach them to reassociate?
Yeah, it happens a lot in trauma because you just don't want to be in your body.
Yes. So notice that. So if you were, and once again, only if it's appropriate for you,
Yeah.
were to describe the sensations of what it's like when there's a dissociation. So I'm also mindful that if that triggers anything for you, then don't do it.
I don't mind. I don't really know how to describe it because it's just nothing. Like I've been catatonic for 5 hours staring at a wall, not moving or anything. So it's like no one's home. I'm nowhere. My thoughts are like stuck, frozen in time. Everything frozen in time. Can't move, can't think, can't do anything. Want to move, but can't.
There's catalepsy for you. There's a hypnotic phenomena right there.
Oh, and a realization I made when you were describing the process, and when I'd learnt Rewind, I never questioned why you actually run the process backwards.
Yes.
And when you described it, I went, oh, of course. The same as when you do the timeline. You take the resources from the future and you take it back and slot it into the event to blow it apart to give the extra resources. I'm like, that's why it goes back, because you take the safe future process stuff back to before the event to blow it all out.
Well, once again, you're using wonderful hypnotic language to describe the process of going back in time into and taking resources. So what resources are we talking about? Notice the ambiguity. And you've sort of referenced with your hand, so you're going above the timeline. So you're meta to that. And you're going back in time to a point which was of significance, restoring resources to that younger self of yours so that you have all of those wonderful things at your disposal that you can then bring forward in time up until the present moment. And so all of that stuff is process orientated.
Yes.
Okay. Notice, are we working with any content, Craig? What are we talking about here?
I just realized I'd learnt both, but I never realized that was why Rewind is done from frame 3, 2, 1. And just suddenly clicked and went, oh, of course, because that's what you've got to do as a process.
Yeah, you're running them back through the timeline.
Yeah, it's kind of highlighting what is missing in a lot of trainings, in the sense that we're taught, oh, well, you do this, But I like how we're going a little bit below that layer now and exploring why we actually do this or what it's actually doing, as opposed to just being told this is the process.
Which is the nuance of understanding, because you can have, at the very basic level, someone could read the script, but you have no idea why the components are important.
Yes.
And a lot of us learn not to use scripts, and we go, but that's just the process. But you've never questioned, I know the process works and I know how to do the process, but it was that realization of, that's why the process is done that way, because that's the underlying fundamental concept that that's how the action is actually translated into a practical outcome.
Yeah. And a lot of people's NLP training is bolted onto their hypnosis training, so they're not really going into a deep dive of what sits inside, like what's under the hood. How does this work?
Yeah.
How does it work for you? How does it work for other people? And so they get given another pattern or another script, and they think this is the way it's done. In actual fact, every single pattern that you learn in NLP is a modeled strategy from somebody else, but it's somebody else's strategies. That's just the way that they did it. That doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone else. And so, just like some inductions will work with some people and not with others, but what I'm highlighting is that what I'm hoping that you see when you look at this material is that when you go back and you look at your favorite patterns or processes, that you go, oh, there's the process instruction. Okay, I wonder what that does. And if you play with that, is that the difference that makes the difference in this person's subjective experience? If people are feeling overwhelmed and their eyes are like this, then usually what's happened is that they've made a picture inside their mind which is nice and close, and you can actually see them watching the picture and they're feeling overwhelmed by it. And if you move the picture back a little bit and you make it small, dark and dim, if you turn it from being a movie into a still picture and you flick it off into the distance, all of a sudden they feel better. Now that's a symptomatic fix. That's not a generative change. That's at the level of symptom. So all you're simply doing is you're noticing inside their process when they talk about being overwhelmed, for instance, and feeling like things are getting on top of them, and you see them gesturing like this, they're showing you their process.
Yes.
And for some hypnotherapists, they miss that because this is the nonverbal communication. This is them showing you how they're structuring their subjective reality. And so, yes, if you ask them to, what happens if you push it away a little bit? What happens if you tilt it a little bit? What happens if you make it still instead of a movie? What happens if you make it black and white? What happens if you make it small, dark and dim?
Yes. I do that as the standard rewind, that I start messing with the submodalities with each frame to keep crunching the process to go, where are their friction points? What can I do to make that frame worse, that one better?
Yes, correct. So now you're doing a contrastive analysis there. So very nice. And
whatever works for that, you just keep reinforcing on that to keep doing that to frame 3. Because I was doing someone and they go, I'm having trouble finding frame 2. It's so far away. And I'm like, perfect.
Beautiful. And now I'll make it go even further than that. So notice that for those of you who have NLP training, this makes a lot of sense. For those of us who have come out of just straight up hypnotherapy training where we've been given a whole bunch of stuff, it seems almost like a different language, because I'm inviting you to think at the level of process rather than content. Okay. And yes, Lisa.
Could I just maybe make some observations about that and see if this might be correct? So I think like with the rewind that we're talking about, that seems to be like a temporal process to me. And then I think like maybe in a lot of the stuff we're doing, we're actually creating a temporal process because we want them to put whatever they're attached to that they don't want to be attached to any further in the past. And we want to bring into, the now and allow them to step into the future. But hopefully bring that future to now to say, okay, well, you're now doing what you want to be doing. So that seems to be a temporal process. And then also with the what Craig was talking about with the changing of the submodalities, that appeared to me to be like we're trying to teach them a control process. So they have control over like where their brain's going and what they're attaching to. Would that be a description of both of those things or not necessarily?
So you'll find that we're temporal element to everything that we do, because we are, moving things from the, like from the present into the past, if it's an unresourceful state they're experiencing now, and moving them into the future into, better possibilities and better realities, and perhaps even changing the way that they think about things in the past as well, and perhaps, preserving the wisdom and letting go of any of the emotion that's no longer relevant or useful for them, so that they can take the gold and leave everything else behind. But we're not teaching them control with the rewind technique, because the key to doing the rewind technique, for instance, this has become about the rewind technique, but the rewind technique is a really useful one.
I was thinking more in terms of like, if you were to sort of like look at the submodalities in any situation, like make the picture big, make the picture small, it doesn't matter whether it's rewind or not. It seems to me like we're sort of saying to them, okay, look, you can get some control over your process here.
Yes, and one of the things that we're presupposing is that people have a really have a clean meta position to move to, and so that means that they can be aware of that they're aware, and that it's unpolluted by any unresourceful experiences or thoughts. So any other unresourceful emotions or thoughts. So we presuppose that they can distance themselves and become aware that they're aware, and be aware of their internal process, but without being influenced in a negative way, so to speak. And so the challenge becomes quite apparent when they don't have a clean meta position. They move into another polluted meta position. In other words, it's, there's judgment about their judgment still. There's, self-recrimination about the way they do things. And that makes it a bit challenging. So part of the challenge for some of them is, how do they find a clean meta position where they're aware of their internal process? And some people aren't aware of their internal process. I trained with Christina Hall. Sorry?
Not many are.
That's why a lot of my treatments initially are about education, teaching them about the psychogeography of their mind and what they're navigating, and then they're able to exercise self-compassion, because then they realize, all right, well, this is just the way I'm structuring my subjective experience, but that can change. This is the way my nervous system runs, and that's perfectly okay because it's keeping me alive. And so then they start to become more kind to themselves. But yes, I think you could take any one of these and you could go, notice this. And that's what I do a lot with anxiety. Notice what you're doing. You play the what if game. You go forward in time. You run a movie. You associate in. You're seeing and hearing through your own eyes, your own skin, your own ears. And then what you're doing is you're playing out the worst possible scenario. I said that's the structure of a post-hypnotic suggestion. I said if only you were using your powers for good instead of evil, and evil being the reverse of live. EVIL and LIVE, and they'd look at me and they go, what? mind blown. I go, we don't need to change the process that you're running because you're getting consistent results. Take a look at how hypnotic you are. You're a fantastic hypnotist. You're just not getting the results that you want. So if we run different content through it, but we keep the structure the same, the process the same, you could just as easily go into the future and think about all the wonderful things that are yet to happen. And as you see that now through your own eyes, ears, and skin, right? Feeling, hearing, seeing, you could fully and completely enjoy every aspect of that experience as you wait with anticipation for that to arrive now. So there's lots of different ways in which you can use it. Same, I'm just hijacking their process, because if they're getting a great result, winner. They're just not getting the results they want, change that, right? But it's the content they're running through it. The process works beautifully. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how I think about this stuff. I don't want to make this a training program, but I think that this might be a good opportunity for us to split up into some breakout rooms. And I was thinking, what could we do that had maybe some fun little things to play with? And because Zoom is such a unique sort of training environment, I haven't really taught anybody hypnotic language or anything like that through this environment. I thought if we break up into little breakout rooms and then we play perhaps pass the hypnotic parcel. How's that sound? Right? And so your job is to create hypnotic language, and you've got your list there. And so a lack of referential index is just, it doesn't have any reference to somebody specific. So teacher, that could be the maths teacher, that could be the science teacher. Parent could be mum or dad, could be somebody else's parent. So there's a lack of reference as to who that is, a lack of specificity there. When we take a look at modal operate as a possibility, this is about things that may happen, could happen, that it possibly could happen. So it also may not. So there's flexibility in there. So that's what a modal operator possibility is relative to a modal operator of necessity. The rules are that there's possibility, there's flexibility. And notice that even wish to and desire in that list they're in my opinion modal operators of desire. So if we take a look at unspecified verbs, this is the process of doing something, but without being too specific about what that is, like learn how specifically, change how specifically, do, wonder. So notice the ambiguity there. And so you'll find hypnotic language is artfully vague. We're not being prescriptive in how they do it. And that provides them with the freedom to do it any which way they want, which is fantastic, because if you're working content free, you don't know what they're doing anyway. And nominalizations are just simply verbs or processes that have been frozen and turned into nouns. That's a way of thinking about it, because you do the process of experiencing. But when we talk about experience as if it's a thing, it's not a thing. So this is a distortion. This is when people are distorting their reality and turning things that aren't things, or turning processes that aren't things into things. So for instance, when someone says, I'm looking for the big love of my life, I say, well, you probably never find it. And that sort of freaks them out a little bit, because, they're not going to find love. It's not a thing. But I go, just out of interest, if you were to explore your relationships and identify the loving behaviors, then where might you notice loving behaviors in your life? When you're looking at your partner now and you see the loving, caring things that they do, might that be the demonstration of love and care or not? But they've turned these processes into nouns, and then they're looking for it in the world. Is it any wonder why they don't find it? But if they drill it back down to behaviors, you've denominalized it, turned it back into a process. So in this instance, we want to turn these things into a thing, because it's hypnotic, and we do reference experiences as having had an experience. For instance, trance is a nominalization. You do the process of trancing. Thoughts, you do the process of thinking. And even then, you can break that down into some of the components of how you're thinking, because thinking is an unspecified verb. So notice that nominalizations become verbs, unspecified verbs, and who's doing the thinking? That's deleted, right? So notice that just with those 4 things there, you can construct a whole bunch of multi-meaning sentences. And that's what I'm going to invite you to do. Is your job is to jump into a group, have a bit of a play, and perhaps, as a bit of a signal, you just put your hand up so that everyone knows who hasn't had a turn yet. And then you'll start with people may, and then I'll pass to Lawrence. And then Lawrence has to pick up where I've left off. And then he can go for an unspecified verb or a nominalization. And then Lawrence will, I'll put my hand down. Lawrence will then flick to somebody else, and then they might pick up it. And one can and then the other person will be selected, be interested in the many experiences that you can have, and just flick it around. You're not working with any content, but what you're doing is you're getting used to just using improvisation and utilization. You're starting to string words together that are hypnotic. It doesn't have to mean anything to your conscious minds, because that's not the part of the mind that we're talking to anyway. So it's good for you to be in rapport with your unconscious mind. But how about we play a little bit with pass the hypnotic parcel? And I don't know, how long should we play with this for, since we're coming up to 11 o'clock, time distortion?
I don't know, what, 10 minutes per group maybe?
10 minutes, yeah, that should be enough to go around, because we're just literally going, all right, I'm going to start with this and then move it on. You've got a list of words in front of you, just start stringing them together. What might help you is to think of like an outcome as you're doing it, even though you don't know what anybody else's outcome is, but if you think about moving them into a desired state. So leave your suggestions in a really positive way. Promote internal representations. In other words, the pictures, the sounds, the feelings, the sense of smell or taste that they're experiencing, leave them in a better place than you found them. So always structure your suggestions towards positive outcomes. As hypnotherapists, I'm sure you're more than capable of doing that. But have a bit of fun. And yes.
Paul, hi,
Yes,
sorry.
yes.
I didn't realise my audio plugged in stopped the thing. I'm driving. It's Geraldine. I'm driving. I'm driving to work. Can I be an observer? But I can't participate. I've had to pull over. I'm in a rush. I've still got to get a bloody corona test on the way through, and I've got to be at work at 1. It's a long drive. So I don't want to go into details, but can I observe? Because I really don't want to have an accident on the way to work.
Yeah, that's fine. So whoever's working with Geraldine, just remember that. But then again, it's good practice to craft things on the fly in the car. One of the ways that I learned hypnotic languages, I used to listen to a whole bunch of podcasts on hypnotic language, and the challenge was staying alert and awake and externally orientated while I was driving. I had a higher outcome, and that was to stay alive. So that allowed me to stay out of the content and still practice. And I found that quite useful. I managed to do that for virtually everyone I listened to, except for Stephen Gilligan. He's got some incredible skill sets, that gentleman. So now I'm noticing that I don't quite have the ability to put people into breakout rooms. Lawrence, do you have that skill set?
Breakout rooms. Here we go. If we do groups of 4.
Yeah, and about 10 minutes, and jump in, have a play. Remember, put your hand up. This way, everyone knows who hasn't had turn yet. Once you've gone through a few times, then put your hand. Once you've gone through again, put your hand up, and then start the process again, and have fun with it. Just be really mischievous with it, and see what you discover.
Okay, well, let's have a look.
Awesome.
Yeah.
There we go. I'm joining breakout 2. There we go. All right. Thanks for that. That was great. It's great when I don't have to run the rooms.
That was fun.
Yeah.
It's nice to see all of your faces too, or most of your faces anyway. So welcome. And how did you go with that? So what was your experience of doing the hypnotic pass the parcel?
Excellent. It was great. Good fun.
What did you notice about it, Anthony? Can we ask?
Just that it wasn't as harrowing as I thought it was going to be. It was, the words were there. It was interesting to bounce off other people, and I was trying to react to the last person to try and string that hypnotic language together, and then content free was interesting. That it was vague, but it still made some kind of sense. It was something tangible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Deborah's just let us know she's having an issue with the camera, so it's all good. We won't take offence or even a gate about it, so it's all good. So yeah, we sort of went off a little bit into, once we started doing little bits and pieces in our group, we then started crafting a whole sentence and then passing it, so that this way you get a good run at the full sentence. So that was a bit of fun there. Yeah, what else did other people experience in your groups?
I think what I found before going into the groups was that I was thinking in my own mind, what kind of sentence would I say normally, naturally? And when I did that, I noticed that a lot of the words I was using were actually on that table already. That the knowledge was kind of already there. It was just, instead of getting caught up in worrying about the table was more about, oh, I'll just say what comes to mind, and I have a pretty good bet that it's going to be on the table already anyway.
Yes, correct. I mean, you're using a lot of these words when you're talking about possibility and you're talking about people thinking and so forth. We're not going into the detail of it, but it's useful to have up your sleeve, and it goes to show you how readily able you are to craft hypnotic language. And part of it is just letting go, not being too worried about whether it's making sense to their conscious mind. It's not for their conscious mind. The intake interview and all sorts of stuff where you're talking to them and you're getting them to share and disclose and all that sort of stuff, great, fantastic. Let them talk all they want. I start talking hypnotically from the moment I speak to them on the phone. When my wife listens to me do an intake, she goes, "You just ran a whole session over the phone." I went, "Yeah." By the time they come in, usually stuff has changed and shifted for them already, and I'm just following up on what I've already facilitated over the phone. I'm just being of service. But the thing is, you'll find that hypnotic language is it's pervasive. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. The question is what the person is the person who's referencing themselves or their experience, referencing themselves in a useful way. So one of the things that I actually pose to my clients, the client session starts as soon as they find you. I would agree. From the moment they read what's on your web page, if they read your web page. Where was I going with it? Does anyone remember what I just said? Because I've just had amnesia.
Yeah, you just said something about is the person referencing themselves?
Oh, yes. So one of the things that I pose to my clients now is when I hear them actually reference themselves in a less than useful way, I go, is that a suggestion that you would pay me for? And if they go, no, and I go, then why are you offering it to yourself then? You're the best hypnotist in the room. And I just get them to think about, well, if you keep talking yourself down, talking your experience down, referencing yourself in that way, if you're paying me good money, do you think that 1 hour with me is going to overrule 165 hours in your head? And you're still 166 hours in your head because you're still in your head. But that in that moment, you're hearing hypnotic language come out. They're using it, and it's self-referencing. And so why would I let that just continue? My goal is to bring their attention to what they're saying about themselves, and so I just keep posing it to them. Is that a suggestion that you'll be paying me for? Well, if not, stop that. Notice what you're doing. What's another way of thinking about yourself? And you'll hear a whole bunch of hypnotic language come out, but the hypnotic language is there all the time. So cool, bit of fun so far. Let's consider the prospect of perhaps working maybe in triads, and let's actually take a look at what's in that little handout. Now, just to be really clear and transparent, the handout was an extract from the NLP Field Guide by Chris and Jules Collingwood. So Chris and Jules are NLP trainers in Sydney, and they have really good association with John Grinder, who's one of the co-developers of NLP. I've trained with Chris in Ericksonian hypnotic language, so I've had direct experience of Chris as a trainer. So from this perspective, you'll see that. One, just let me put it to you. This is a great resource book, but I'm also going to be really clear. If you haven't got any background in NLP, it can seem a little bit jargonistic because NLP is very jargonistic. I remember when I was looking at it before I started studying NLP, I would try and pick up a NLP, manual or book and try and understand what they were talking about. And I just thought it's just a completely different language, and that's partly because of the linguistics. And also, I want to bring you to your attention that that the field of NLP is best learnt in person rather than through a book, because of the way in which it's described in the book is not necessarily the way in which you would experience it from a somatic experience, from an in-the-room experience perspective. So that's part of the challenge right now with running training through Zoom around this stuff, is because there are just some things that you cannot do through this format that you could do in person. And there's a whole bunch of things that you'll be missing because we're getting a very one-dimensional view of someone. So If we take a look at association, take a look at the words to direct subjects to associate, step into, get into, drop into, shift into. Notice that the key word there is into. However you choose to do it, you can float and drift into, you can float and drift out of. So notice into and out of seem to be the primary words that you need to reference, and whether you do an into with a float or a step into or step back from. Step back from, what do you reckon that would be? Association or disassociation?
Disassociation.
Yeah, so you hear people use this all the time. Let's take a step back and take a look at the big picture. How's that for just really simple process instructions? Take a step back, look at the big picture. Not only that, but they're giving you size, because it's a big picture. They're also implying that it's a picture, not a movie. So it's a still image for them. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture. And so look is the process as well. So we don't know what they're looking at, but notice into, out of, just nice and simple. Now, when it comes to the logical levels piece here, that's a link to logical inclusion sets. So this has got to do with, and I don't want to go into too much detail about it because it's a training in its own right. But if you think about a person's intent, that's going to be at a higher logical level to the outcome. In other words, the outcome is here, and the intent for why they want the outcome sits above it. Okay, so that's at the higher logical level. It's a higher, it's a view of the outcome, or it's the need that the outcome is meeting. So this would be, every behavior has a positive intent. In other words, every behavior gets you something is a presupposition in NLP. So in other words, regardless of whether the outcome is beneficial for them or not, that behavior that they're engaging in is fulfilling some sort of need. That need is at a higher logical level. So it's not at the same level of thinking as the outcome itself. It sits above the outcome. It's for what purpose? So if you take a look, what for, or for what purpose, or what will having that do for you, are questions that actually elicit the intent or the higher logical level that sits behind the outcome. To chunk down is to go into specifics. So it's at, so let's say for instance, we choose cat as an example. A chunk down from cat would be a more specific type of cat. Okay, so let's say for instance, a Bengal cat is a very specific type of cat. Notice we get more detail. So that's chunking down. Chunking up from cat would be what? Does anyone know?
Animal.
Cat.
What kind of cat?
Yeah.
Mammal.
Any type of feline.
Feline. So feline is the higher logical level. Makes sense?
And then you go further up to furry pet.
You could if you want to become really artfully vague. So, and well, actually furry pet might restrict you, because if you go from feline, you can't put under, well, you could, it depends on where you live. Furry pet might be lion, right? So you could, yeah. But if we go from feline to mammal, notice the further up we go, a Bengal cat is a type of feline. A feline is a mammal. It sits logically underneath that category, and that's the nature of chunking up and chunking down. Chunking laterally, though, is if we go cat and we go up to feline, and we then go laterally, what's another kind of female? So what's that like, right? So that could be another word. So what's another feline? So it still sits under feline. So under feline, we couldn't put dog, but we could put, for instance, lion as an example of feline. Yeah. Under furry pet, though, might be a little bit hard for some people to put lion. Mike Tyson probably could, but generally, people aren't thinking of domestic pets in the same way. So if we take a look at sideways chunk, this is lateral thinking. So what's that like? This is also the domain of metaphor. So for instance, my cat is like a lion is now this lateral chunking, this movement to a lateral perspective, that I'm looking at some aspect or some attribute or some quality of the cat, and it's like a lion, right? So now we're actually saying that this has an equivalence. Okay, so life is like a box of chocolates is a lateral chunk, and it's a metaphor. So there's something about it that sits underneath there. Life and chocolate, in some way, shape, or form, must sit under some sort of higher logical level. So, like I said, it's when we're working with people and we're being process orientated, it's okay for you to want what you want, and there's probably some other aspect of yourself that knows why you want it, and perhaps you don't know consciously what that unconscious intent is. So here I am playing around with just intent and creating a perceptual split, conscious and unconscious mind, and also conscious mind, unconscious mind. What are they? They're nominalizations. So here's the hypnotic language. It's really just mind, and it's really just awareness. And perhaps you can integrate that even more deeply as you start to process that. So here I'm using hypnotic language, but I'm talking about conscious mind, unconscious mind. It's really just about mind. It's about awareness. Notice where you can go. So the moment I'm talking about the intent, though, I'm chunking up. All right. When we take a look at changing perspectives, self and the other. So before, when I was having a bit of a play with Kate, and I was inviting her to float up and out of her body and to, to observe from the back of the room that body that's sitting in that chair, I'm dissociating mind and body. So there's an implied mind-body split there, and to be an observer, so from a dissociated perspective, and yet the body is doing something as it's looking, listening, feeling over there in that chair. So there's a changing perspective. So there's self, there's other, and there's also observer. So we could look at it from that perspective. We can also dissociate from the context. So for some of you who are familiar with the timeline process, let's say, for instance, you float up and out of the current context and you float above the timeline. And below on the timeline, you see a string of pearls. And each one of those pearls is a particular context. And I'm not sure whether each one of those contexts has a particular color. And perhaps there's one that you notice from that perspective that really attracts you and draws you to it. Perhaps there's something inside of that. So here's a separation from context, but now you're looking from a different context down on those contexts, and you're looking at it from a different perspective. So this is how this stuff can play out quite nicely. When we take a look at elements for process instructions, and you take a look at time, obviously there's the temporal stuff that Lisa pointed to, past, present, future. There's association and disassociation. There's perceptual position, so self, other, and also the context itself, chunking up, chunking down, and chunking laterally. And then representational systems are just your 5 senses. So what you see, what you hear, what you feel, as in touch, tactile, not emotions. I don't put emotions under that because each emotion has its own coding. Each emotion that we label is it's a meta process that we're doing. When we label happiness, for instance, it's not the experience of happiness, it's a nominalization. The sensations that we experience in our body, like the warm and fuzzies, that's the stuff that I'm interested in. That's more somatic, that's tactile, can be associated, it can be dissociated, can be moving, could be still. There's all the submodalities there. But when we're talking about kinesthetics, we're talking about the somatic experience. And when we're talking about smell and taste, that's also part of your 5 senses as well. So any one of those representational systems can be utilized. For instance, the sweet smell of success or the bitter taste of defeat. All of these are suggestions, aren't they? And they include qualities. So notice that the content that we can use in process instructions are locations and environments. So everything happens in some sort of context. If someone's having a problem, where are they having a problem? When they have a solution, where might they have the solution? Maybe the solution is in the same environment that they previously had the problem. Notice I've moved the problem into the past because previously had the problem, not having the problem, not going to have the problem, but they've had the problem in a particular context, and you can now have the solution in the present environment as well. Behaviors and skills. So as you put new behaviors into the environment or new skills, that's part of the content you can run through. Information or activities or beliefs or identity. All of these are the content that you can run through the process. But really what we're playing around with process instructions, moving people through time, associating them into wonderful experiences, dissociating them from stuff that's not useful for them, getting a bit of a perspective on it. And even then, even the stuff that they're doing really well, you can get them looking at themselves from lots of different perspectives to really fully appreciate their magnificence and their splendor, and then to associate into it if you want, and really feel that from deep within. So there's lots of different ways in which you can do it. So I think I've given you plenty of examples of process-orientated suggestion. How about we have a bit of a play with it? And when you move into a triad, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to play around with having your partner identify an outcome that they want for themselves. So one person will identify the outcome, and what you'll do is I just want you to tag team the shit out of that person. So both people are going to act as therapists, and you're just going to tag team. Now this takes a bit of skill, right? Because you're not actually saying anything, but you're both working to facilitate an outcome. But if it's content free, it doesn't really matter, because the person will make their own mind up what they accept and what they don't accept. But this is a bit of fun, right? Because most people don't work with a partner. And so you don't have to come up with all the language. That gives you some time to offer something and be okay with a pause. And that gives your partner some time to listen to something and then riff off that and then throw something in there. And so you don't have to keep it all going. All right? So that takes a bit of pressure off people. You just have to learn to play with each other well, that's all. And so one person will offer something just like you did, and the other person will offer something. And just be okay with just going between the two and having a bit of a pause between the suggestions. But the person who's on the receiving end of the suggestions, you're not to tell them anything about your outcome. I just want you to think about your outcome. Right? You don't have to consciously know. Just if you get a congruency signal that you're okay, that you've got something, then be okay with that. All right? Are there any questions about that? Because this is a bit of fun. It's a little bit different, isn't it?
I'm confused.
Excellent. You're confused? And as you move now from that state of confusion, I wonder where you might go, just briefly, to tap into all those resources that you know that you have inside as a skilled therapist, Kylie. And perhaps you'll pop out of time for a moment and then pop in. So I'll be clearer with the instructions. You're going to have perhaps a group of 3. I think we should have enough of 3, judging by the look of it. And one person will hold the outcome in their mind, but won't necessarily tell the other people in the room what their outcome is. The other 2 are going to be the therapists, so to speak, and you're going to bounce off each other. You'll just offer suggestions, getting people to think about things from different time zones or different time frames, different levels, different perceptions, and it doesn't have to make sense for the conscious mind. Just see what comes out. But the other person's not going to tell you what they're holding in their head as an outcome for themselves. So this is the beauty of this, is you can work on anything you want. You don't have to reveal a single damn thing. You can maintain your privacy and actually get some therapy without having to reveal anything. You don't have to be any more vulnerable than you need to be to engage in this process, yet you can get wonderful suggestions given to you by people who have got already very useful skills. So how's that? Does that help, Kylie?
Yeah.
Excellent. And then once you've done that for a little bit, then swap, right? You don't have to resolve anything. So Katja, thanks. So Katja's going to leave us very shortly because she's got work.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I would love to practice, but probably after that, I will just watch the
the video.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. See you, Katja. So even if you're in a pair, just one person will be the person who's on the receiving end of the suggestions. The other person will just be the person offering suggestions, and then do that for a bit. I don't know how long should we do this for, Lawrence? What do you reckon?
Well, it's 11:24 now, so maybe about 10 minutes or so, and then it gives people an opportunity to come back and unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we can look at, how do we then encourage people to move out of, for instance, the problem state into the desired state? Because what you're doing right now is you're getting people to think about their desired state, their goal, their outcome. So there's a present state where we are now, and there's a desired state where we want to be. What we're doing is just getting them to think about their desired outcome. And perhaps you can associate them into the desired outcome now, even though they might not have a resolution to the problem that they came in with. And perhaps the resolution to the problem isn't necessary for them to really experience now what it is that they've come here for. And so, once again, Craig just laughed, right? catching me? Catching me in my craftiness?
Yep.
Right? Because if they don't know what the outcome feels like, then where's their evidence for success? How would they know? What would they see? What would they hear? What would they feel that would let them know that this has been a successful resolution to the problem? All right? We want to move them out of the problem for a little bit. Okay? So here's something to play with. Any questions about this? All right, so we've lost Uli there, so we're down to, and then there was how many?
Okay, we can have 4 groups at 3, and I'll rotate around the rooms as well.
Excellent. Off you go. Have a play. If you set me up as a host, Lawrence, then I can bounce around between the rooms.
Okay.
And then rather than me getting in there and doing what I already do, I can just listen in and provide some additional assistance. How's that?
Done.
Excellent. So
you need to go and do those rooms.
All right, I'll do the rooms. So let's set them up. I'll recreate the rooms. And so, all right, looks like everyone's got 3 in there, which is fantastic. And let me just take a look. So we definitely don't want that after 30 minutes. All right, so so let's say, for instance, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, so it's 11:26 now. Aim for about 11:40.
Yep, and countdown after closing breakout room. So 60 seconds, it'll let you know when this breakout room's automatically done. All right, ready to go. We're all popped out of it because it was a forced ejection out of the breakout rooms. So how did you go? Because that's a very different little activity, especially through the Zoom format.
That was great. Yeah.
What did you discover as you played with this for a bit?
I'm being pushed out of my comfort zone, which is a good thing.
Great. That's excellent, because that's where your growing edge is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's by all means embrace that, lean into the discomfort, and become more comfortable with it.
Yeah, queen of discomfort.
And what about you?
And Janie, you did amazing. Both you and Anthony, like regardless of what the topic was, everything was relevant. All of the content that Paul gave was extremely relevant, and your tone and the spacing. After Paul said about the spacing, it made complete sense, and then it gave you time to imagine the possibilities and feel it and see it. It was awesome.
Wow.
It was good to share the experience as a team hypnotizing, because there was lots of shrugs and kind of, but it was really great. It was really encouraging to do that with you, Janie. Kind of, we're able to encourage each other, and or whatever. It felt great.
Yeah. For those of us that weren't in the room, can I just ask what you mean by the spacing, so that everyone else can benefit from that as well?
Sorry?
Oh.
You mentioned something about the spacing between...
Oh, sorry. Paul popped into our room and just said that you didn't have to fill the space constantly with language.
Yep.
That by allowing the silence, then the client can then make the creations or imagine the possibilities. So you didn't have to always fill the voids, and it gave them space, and and their tone put you in that trance to then made you think about what they just said, and then you imagine that, and then they just slipped back in and then took you to somewhere else. It was fantastic.
Yeah, so some people think that they have to continue to fill the space with words. I remember I was on a training as a participant, and I had this person who had literally remembered the entire script. It was on a and they'd never had a hypnotic experience before. They'd never been a client. They'd never been on a training. It was their first time, and they literally said, so sit in the chair, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and as I continue to talk to you, you can hear the sound of my voice. And they just kept, literally for 20 minutes at that speed, they literally regurgitated the entire training manual and this particular induction. And then at the end of the 20 minutes, they said, oh man, I worked hard in that session. And what was it like for you? Like, interesting.
the minute waltz in 30 seconds.
It was quite an ordeal, and I think they worked harder than they needed to, and because they didn't know what this is all about, and they thought it was all about the words, they hadn't thought about the process, and they hadn't thought about, how do you create space for people to sort of just drop into an experience for a bit, and that if they're referencing suggestions that have a kinesthetic component to it, that takes a little bit more time for them to process, because the kinesthetic system is the slower system, as opposed to the visual representational systems, where you can see lots of pictures simultaneously, you can hear things simultaneously, and perhaps in a more linear way, but the kinesthetic system takes a little bit of time for it to get going. So when you are suggesting things that people drop into an experience and feel that fully, you can, and then just even the pausing creates what we call punctuation ambiguity. This is the beauty of your embedded suggestions. Your embedded suggestions will naturally start to come out when you start to create a little pause on either side of it. But be okay with just going, and as you continue to breathe, and listen to everything I say. Now, are they breathing and listening to everything I say, or am I telling them, listen to everything I say? The breath on either side creates that gravitas that what comes next is meaning. If it's an embedded suggestion, it sinks it in even deeper. And be okay with thinking on the fly. You know, as you create that space, it's also for your brain to catch up or to think about where you're going to take them. So yes, that's what we meant by spacing, creating a bit of space. So ready to play with a bit more of this?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry for the other group, I didn't get a chance to pop in. 10 minutes seems really short in this space. It seems like it's really quick in and out. So this time I'm going to invite you to play with the problem for a little bit, but to have them dissociate from the problem. So what you've been doing is you've perhaps been playing with association into the desired state, and having them feel what it's like to have the resolution of their problem, and to perhaps look backwards in time from a time after they've received the benefits of the session and notice just how good they feel and all the positive ongoing benefits associated with having made the desire to change and transform themselves. So we want to associate them into good stuff, but we also want to dissociate them from the problem, but also perhaps while still exploring the problem, but from a dissociated perspective. Because if they're in the problem and they're feeling all the somatics of the problem, we don't want them to re-experience it and have a full-blown experience. We just want them to perhaps observe as if like a fly on the wall, or, you know, like a drone floating around, or to see it through the eyes of other people. So if you were an observer to the experience and you were just there noticing these people having this interaction, you know, notice what you notice, hear what you hear from that perspective. Obviously, you know, you don't want them to be associated in a particular role in there other than as the observer. So this is an opportunity for them to get a sense of the problem, because sometimes people will talk about a problem as if it's ongoing and never ending and it has no parameters around it. That in itself is a hypnotic perspective, because everything has a context and every context has boundaries around it. And there's boundary conditions around the problem as well, but perhaps they've deleted that from their experience. And so perhaps as you sit there observing that happen in that context, you notice when it stops. You notice when it just ends. You notice when it begins. Perhaps you notice the middle of it as well. So notice, now I'm playing with time, but I'm also highlighting there's limitations here on where the problem is. There's limitations. It doesn't extend on an ongoing basis. So if we look at Martin Seligman's work in positive psychology around the 3 Ps of pessimism, permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization, that a pessimist will say, everything's crap, it's crap all the time, and if something bad's going to happen, it happens to me. There's the 3 Ps, right? So to a degree, we're going, all right, well, now we're depersonalizing it. We want to dissociate from the problem. Associate in just enough to have an experience of it, but then dissociate it so that they don't re-experience the pain. And then to look at it from lots of different angles, so that then we can start to identify, well, where might some useful resources come in? And if we don't look at it as something that's bad, then if we look at it as what's also useful inside of the current conditions that may be worthwhile preserving. From that perspective, we can make sure that they have an opportunity to mine the current circumstances for gold, maintain the existing strategies that are working for them, while changing the parts of the strategy that perhaps need optimizing and tweaking. And then this way, they're not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Perhaps some stuff is working really well for them, and they haven't noticed it because they're so caught up in their pain. So from that perspective, from this perspective, I just want you to dissociate them. Have them observe the situation that they're in and the other players in the interaction if there are other players, and to look at it from lots of different angles, and to perhaps run it as a bit of a movie where they can observe it, just like an observer does on a television. So you can use parts of the rewind technique in this as well, where they're watching what happens when the problem is at play. When does it start? When does it stop? What are some of the conditions? And how do they see it differently from that perspective? And I wonder what resources they might take and what sort of insights they might gain from really observing it from that, observer position. So have a bit of a play with that. So what we'll do is we'll recreate the group. So you're in a different group now, because we're not really solving anybody's problem, but what we're doing is we're just playing around with some of these different perspectives. So I'll recreate the rooms. and another 10 minutes. Have a bit of a play with that and see how you go. Hearing some awesome stuff in there, picking up little hints and tips along the way as well. So how did you find that as a bit of fun?
Good.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
There you go. Any thoughts or commentary about that particular exercise, or even about anything that we've covered in the last 2 hours? I know it's 2 hours already.
Yeah.
I think everyone's minds are blown to some extent, hopefully.
Absolutely, Lawrence.
I did have something that was sort of on my mind, Paul, as we've been doing this, a sort of process versus content. And just a thought that occurred, and I may be wrong, does content sort of just build the picture and ignite the imagination? And we should be looking at the process as the way of making the change. And then one step back from the process would be recognizing the process and looking at how it works.
Right, dissociating from the process to recognize the process. I love it, Anthony.
Well, yeah, well,
inside of that was
to learn to be able to implement these things. So if you said like, okay, great, now you pick up a script and there's all this content which is painting this big vivid picture, which is the imagination's fired up, they're in that state. I'm looking at the process, and then I want to be looking at, well, how does that process work for me as the therapist? Or is that too much?
What a lovely set of processes inside of that, without necessarily specifying what the content of the script was. I'm just highlighting that you're doing it already, right? To look at the picture and you know, so you're already in a sense doing it. The moment you start to leave out some of the description, all you've got left really is the process. So if you strip out some of the content, right, and you talk in you know, in really vague, ambiguous terms without necessarily defining what's in the material, it makes it very hard to do anything other than primarily process-orientated suggestions. That's the beauty of working content-free, because, you know, there's a picture, all right? So we're obviously something we see. It's a big picture. It's a bright picture. It's, you know, so already you were sort of, you know, highlighting some things. Just to step back and observe the process. Once again, you know, there's the dissociation to be able to find a meta position to observe something that's happening. So let's say, for instance, you're, I don't know, doing like a garden path induction type scenario where they're walking through a forest and stuff like that. Sure. My recommendation would be, you know, take a look at a script like that and then just go, let's ignore the content that it's a garden, right? And what's actually being suggested? You know, is it to walk? Is it to feel? Is it to, you know, is it to look? Is it bright? Is it dim? Is it, you know, is it loud? Is there something off in the distance? Is there something nearby? Is there a sensation like a feeling of warmth, even though it might come from the sun above the head? You know, do they get a bird's eye view? Do they float up? Do they float out? Do they drift? You know, what are the things that are the person's being told to do inside their mind? And then, you know, you'll more than likely identify the process in there, right? That as the garden path continues to wind its way down each step you take, you can feel more comfortable. And as you breathe in the fresh air, you can relax and let go. So notice that I don't have a script here on a garden path, but I could probably form one as I think about what I want them to do, right? And as you look down and see your feet treading carefully on that path, notice that each confident step you take down, you relax. See, now if you have to look down at your feet, I haven't specified through your own eyes, but perhaps you're looking down at your feet and seeing your feet as it walks on the path. So I haven't been specific, but however you choose to do it. Perhaps you're floating above your head, looking down at the feet, walking confidently. Perhaps you're seeing through your own eyes and you're in your body, looking down as if you're there. But notice that these things are an orientation in perspective. So my recommendation would be take the list that's in the book, that like in that PDF that you sent, and look at everything that you currently hold near and dear to yourself that you like to fall back on and use, and look for, perhaps get a highlighter, and if it's a script that you use, just highlight the process instructions, see whether it conforms to the stuff that's in the manual, and then just notice how much of that's in there. And you'll probably find that the content is just what you're using. It could be a garden path, it could be a floating cloud, it could be a, could be a bird's eye view. It's lots of the content's just the content, but it's the process inside of that when you start to become more comfortable and confident with that, allows you to be able to structure anything on the fly. So yeah, multiple perspectives. I sort of think of it as a little bit like it's a video editing suite or an audio editing suite, or I mean, generally when we're talking about visual and auditory, we have references for changing settings. Those settings are things that we can play with. The tilt of the view, the distance, the size, whether it's panoramic or whether it's framed. Whether it's near or far, whether things are in color or black and white. Anytime you watch a movie, for instance, like for instance, Schindler's List, black and white movie, but the blood was always red. That was interesting. Those sorts of little video editing sort of highlights an aspect inside of the content, but it's the coloration of it. It's the contrast. It separates itself from the context a little bit, but it sort of really stands out. And we can do that inside of our mind. And so anything that we can do in a video editing suite, audio editing suite, we can do inside our mind. So therefore, when you start to suggest it, as if you were playing around with a video or audio editing software, well, that'll provide you with some useful process suggestions, in my opinion. The kinesthetics are just about where you move things in your body, the warmth, texture. So it's worthwhile looking at the list of submodalities that are out there. There's plenty of lists out there, because all of those things, every time you change them, that's a change in the process. That's a change in an aspect of the quality of the experience, regardless of the content. Thanks, Aaron. So hopefully that's useful. But going back and looking at all the scripts, inductions or evocations, however you choose to use them, eye fixation, what are the process suggestions inside of that? Heavy light arms, what are the process suggestions? Put your left hand out, palm upwards, put your right hand out, wrist upwards to the sky. Imagine a balloon, imagine it pulling up, tugging up. There'll be process suggestions inside of that. So lots of cool stuff inside of that. Go back and revisit everything that you've learned. And thanks, Craig. And yeah, see whether you can identify. It's good training for you, and then take the little bits and pieces that you like, make it part of your own pattern.
And I have to say a big thank you also to Paul for not only hosting today and offering some incredible insight there, but also for suggesting a topic in the first place, because it perfectly embodies the whole point of this practice group, in the sense of being able to take some of those building blocks of what we do and to be able to focus in a little bit more on that, and to be able to play with it and just have some fun with it, and to get a better understanding of it. So thank you, Paul, for hosting what I think has been a really incredible session.
Clarence. And remember, I've been where you've been, all of you. We all start off
bedroom.
In the bedroom. Yes, correct. I start there and I finish there. Sometimes even my own. And just having a bit of fun. The thing is, 22 years ago when I started, this was never something that was brought to my attention. This was never part of my training. We were given, here's a PREM, positive reinforcement, ego strengthening and motivation. Here's the staircase induction. But nobody actually went in there and deconstructed it. This is the part of the process that actually works. And so, progressive muscle relaxation, all those sorts of things. We all start with learning from people who perhaps have been replicating what the people before them have shown them. But dare I say that when my hypnosis training was unlocked and unpacked for me was when I actually started studying NLP, because NLP is process orientated. So you get trained to be process orientated. Then I looked back at all the stuff that I'd learned, went, there it all is. So it's there for those who have the eyes and the ears to see and hear. And that's the journey that, in a sense, we're all on. Some people are more technically orientated than others, and it's not for everyone. Once again, you can plug and play any script, any induction you like. But if you want to be free, then you have to move beyond technique, and you have to understand the principle. Then what's the pattern, and then what's the process. So this is really around the principle. Then you can start to look at what the patterns are. Then you can start to look at where those patterns can be crafted into processes. So remember, at the level of principle, which is a higher logical level than the pattern, then you've got more freedom. Where a lot of people are trained is at the level of technique. And that's why they don't feel like they've got the flexibility to be able to ad lib and do things on the fly. When you have the principle, though, you have greater scope for behavioral flexibility. And that's an important part of your growth as therapists, of all of us. And I'm no exception. So when I go and train with someone, I'm interested in what's the principles that keep coming up and how have they interpreted that principle into a series of processes, because that's their technique. But you'll find the principles of the principles of the principles, because they're universal truths. They're there in everything. And so you'll see this time and time again. That's why I don't teach anything that's new, because it's already there. But the way in which we order and sequence it is vastly different. And that's the beauty of diversity in our industry. But when you train with someone and they do, this is my process, this is my technique, you're going to find that all the principles are there because the principles are the principles. And if you've got the eyes and ears to see and hear, you can then go, great, I've taken that and I've adapted it. And this is now my approach to applying that pattern and those principles in my own process. And that's a huge, it's a huge relief to know that anywhere you go, no matter who you're working with, you'll always have something up your sleeve if you understand the principles. But if you're always stuck at the level of technique, you'll feel stuck, because when the technique doesn't work, it's not because the technique didn't work. It's because the person communicating the principles and the process didn't have an understanding of how it all comes together. And so they're just doing a white wings packet. That's my interpretation. This is my perspective. They're doing a white wings packet, expecting to create something on the fly. And that's not the way it works. You want to be a chef, not just somebody who reconstitutes prepackaged ingredients and then puts that out there. If you want to be masterful at what you do, so that's all the people who are masterful at what they do. They understand the principles, they understand the patterns, and then they craft their own processes, and that's what works for them, and that's what they teach. And there's plenty of money in doing that, but dare I say, the goal is for everyone really to be masters in their own right, not to be an Ericksonian, not to be Milton Erickson. And that's why I posted that thing around Stephen Gilligan into the group as well, because it's interesting. Stephen Gilligan was hypnotized into modeling Erickson because nobody could understand what Erickson was doing. So he was engaged in the deep trance identification, literally absorbed Milton Erickson. His journey is to be Stephen Gilligan, not Milton Erickson. And I found that really refreshing. I think that's the journey that we're all on, to be our own versions of our best self. And you see people at a certain stage in their history, and it's easy to forget or not recognize that they've all had a journey and they've all had their own stuff to overcome. So trust yourselves, back yourselves. You've all got it. I've heard it. You're all amazing. Go out there and trust yourselves and just keep going and delving into the principles, and then finding the way it works for you and your clients, and go out there and be amazing and successful. The world needs you. So thanks very much for allowing me to host today. And I look forward to seeing some of the discussions that emerge in the group as well. And thanks, Lawrence. Thanks for setting up the group in the first place, and for organising these things. This is wonderful.
And so, yeah, thank you, Paul. And I guess we'll wrap it up for there for the time being. But yeah, look, if you guys have any ideas about what kind of future topics you want for the practice groups, please feel free to send them through. Today was probably very much more like what the original vision of the practice group was, to be able to head off and to explore and to play. So if you have other topics like that, please feel free to bring them forward, and we can look at doing them over the next coming ones. Otherwise, in the meantime, go and have a wonderful weekend.
Be successful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Lauren.
Enjoy. Stay safe.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.